Look, you probably just didn't understand this movie quite like I did. So, let me explain it to you. What's up?
Be inspired to do things differently.
Welcome back to the channel, everybody. And what a time to return, because this video is a classic. This past weekend was arguably the biggest cinematic event of our lifetime with Barbenheimer. Barbie and Oppenheimer released on the same day, July 21st, 2023. But today, we're only going to talk about the half of Barbenheimer that actually matters, which is Barbie. I'm not being hyperbolic when I say that Barbie was my most anticipated movie of the year. I was unbelievably excited for this movie, and because of that, perhaps I placed an unfair amount of expectations on it. So if it sounds like I'm setting this review up to be something of a disappointment, I'm not. It's just that Barbie ended up being the definition of a mixed bag for me. It's a bit of a weird movie, but I think it's beautiful at the same time. There are a lot of things about Barbie that I really like, and it is obviously a very technically impressive film. The production design by Sarah Greenwood is unbelievable. This is some production design that I think is worthy of the golden days of classic Hollywood. It is truly an immersive and unique experience. The set decoration, the costuming, all of that was absolutely phenomenal. And it should go without saying. The cinematography is lush and vibrant. Rodrigo Prieto did an incredible job shooting this movie. It is bursting with the most brilliant shades of pinks and pastels in every single frame. And obviously Greta Gerwig brought her auteur sensibility to this movie with her very self-assured sense of direction. And I think Greta Gerwig's personality is really bursting in Barbie in every single frame. And not just in terms of the technicality of her direction, but there are a lot of Easter eggs that can be found within the Barbie movie that I think might escape a viewer on a first watch. So I do think it's a movie that is absolutely worth rewatching, if for no other reason than to glean what I was able to take away from it the second time around. Barbie is an interesting movie because the conflict revolves around Margot Robbie, who is named stereotypical Barbie in the movie, when she begins to have very human thoughts, very dark thoughts about death and just a general sense of unfulfillment that causes her to spiral into an existential crisis. And she needs to go see Weird Barbie, who is played by Kate McKinnon, who is absolutely hilarious in this movie. She does a lot of great physical comedy, and I think her performance really stands out in a very crowded and star-studded cast. But I grew up with a younger sister, so I know very well what a Weird Barbie is, and I just thought the whole visual gag was hilarious, and I couldn't get enough of it. But we learn that the reason Barbie is having these thoughts is because her relationship with whoever is playing with her in the real world is a little bit strained, and in order to rid herself of these existential thoughts, she has to travel to the real world where she needs to mend her relationship with whichever girl happens to be playing with her. And that's the conflict of the movie. That's the inciting incident. This movie sets up Barbie to have a journey of self-discovery, a journey of what is essentially a coming-of-age story while adding in this element of absurdist existentialism. And that is really interesting to me. Unfortunately, we never really see this journey play out for Barbie in its entirety, because about halfway through the movie decides to shift into a more external conflict that involves Ken and overtaking Barbie Land. And this is really where my biggest issue with Barbie lies, in that the movie has so many things that it wants to say. It has so many different directions that it's being pulled in, and I don't think this movie is given enough time to really explore any of the issues that it wants to at the length that each issue deserves. There is no mistake that Barbie is a pro-feminist, dismantle the patriarchy movie, and those words alone are enough to trigger a certain group of people. But I found the message to be very effective and very uplifting for women, and while I think you can absolutely agree with this movie's message, I do also think that it can feel a little bit heavy-handed at times, because the movie will stop 2 to 3 times to have a monologue about feminism or female empowerment. And again, while these things are absolutely positive, I think these kind of scenes lose their impact the more you do them. But I'm not going to try to take away from these scenes, because I am well aware that one scene in particular involving America Ferrera may very well be a lot of women's favorite scene in the entire movie. This was just my experience with the film. But some of the messaging did feel like low-hanging fruit at times, because it felt more like the movie was lecturing the audience rather than trying to engage in a dialogue with the audience and respecting us as viewers. And the reason that this kind of stood out to me is because Greta Gerwig has tackled similar themes of feminism, womanhood, gender roles, mother and daughter relationships in her previous movies like Lady Bird and Little Women, and I think it was done with a lot more tact in those movies. However, I will add in the caveat that Barbie is probably going to be a lot of people's first Greta Gerwig movie, so she may have felt like she just needed to take the swing, and I admire that. Nothing about Barbie is safe. It is a very bold movie, and I absolutely admire that in and of itself. There are a lot of things going on in this movie, as I said, but the single biggest issue I really had with the movie was the Mattel stuff. Yes, the actual company that manufactures the Barbie dolls has a role in this movie, and I don't think any of this worked at all, because it felt very cynical to me. A lot of the material involving Mattel in the movie attempts to be self-aware, and it has this pithy meta attitude towards corporate consumerism and capitalism, but even though it constantly winks at the audience saying, "We get it, guys, we're the bad guys, we don't have any women at the executive level in our company," and it's just a very strange thing to include in this movie, because they essentially function like this secret agency that exists to capture Barbie because they can't have her out existing in the real world, and it just doesn't work for me. because it is a complete waste of time and it doesn't add anything to the movie. It doesn't add anything to the story. It doesn't add anything to the character. It doesn't add anything to the themes that this movie is trying to explore. And I honestly think you could have cut all of the stuff involving Mattel, and that would have shaved a good 12 to 15 minutes off the runtime of this movie, because you forget they're even there for long stretches of the movie. But what I find so fascinating about Barbie is the way that it does attempt to juggle so many big ideas. There is a lot of social commentary in this movie, and yes, it's going to upset some people. That's a given. They're probably upset about this stuff already, but the fact that it's in a Barbie movie is probably just going to make them more upset. But what I think is really interesting is this movie does have an element that is largely focused on Barbie as a character and exploring this journey of self-discovery and growing and learning what it means to be human. And it deals with all of Barbie's existential angst, her despair, and all the anxiety that she's feeling. And it is played beautifully by Margot Robbie, who is not only the personification of a Barbie doll with her otherworldly beauty, but she sells this existential crisis perfectly. She does a phenomenal job with her role in this movie, and I really cannot state enough how good of a job she does. And that's why I think it's a shame that the movie didn't necessarily focus on this very personal journey that they establish for Barbie in this movie, because the movie is just pulling itself in so many different directions that it doesn't really have the time to dedicate to Barbie's personal character arc that I personally think would have been the most interesting aspect of the film, because when it focuses on the metaphysics of Barbie as a character and Barbie Land and the relationship between Barbie Land and the real world, I think that's when the movie really shines. My favorite scene in this entire movie is shortly after Barbie and Ken arrive in the real world. Barbie is feeling a little overwhelmed to find that it is nothing like Barbie Land. So she sits down and she closes her eyes and she just allows herself to be sad. And she's taking in all of these emotions, and then she opens her eyes and she sees a man in the park and he's smiling, and then she sees a couple that are arguing, and she's kind of recognizing that being human is hard. It's painful. But there is joy, there is beauty in it, and that, to me, is when the movie fucking sings. Because that's kind of where the movie ends as well. It's just the movie doesn't dedicate the entirety of its runtime to exploring this idea. And I think that's a shame, because there really is this undercurrent of the idea that we all live in a plastic world to some degree, and sort of stripping down that facade and embracing the experience of being human. I thought that was really interesting stuff. When this movie commits to Greta Gerwig's vision, it is incredible. But there are just so many things going on that it's really difficult to parse out what the movie wants the main focus to be. Because there is also an element of critiquing the very idea of Barbie and how that might affect young girls, how that might affect womanhood, how that affects American beauty standards. But the movie never really elaborates on this theme either, because it's always kind of trying to bring everything back to the central message. And the movie is very much anchored in that message, and this kind of goes back to my criticism about the character arc that Barbie is set up for, but we never really see it unfold in its entirety, and it's because the social commentary is very much leading the characters. The characters are not directing the movie in a way that allows for the social commentary to take place. And again, this is just my personal experience with the movie, so that's why I found it to be a little heavy-handed at times. But as with anything, as with all great pieces of art, I think there's value in re-examining it, whether that's through a rewatch, taking the time to reflect on it, or whatever you want to do. And that's very much what I did with Barbie. And upon this examination, I found something that I thought was really powerful. Hold on 1 minute. Before this guy launches into his think piece about how he thinks this movie is some profound meditation of the struggles of both modern men and women relation, it's no surprise to anyone that Ryan Gosling is hilarious. Anyone who has seen The Nice Guys should have expected this, but Ryan Gosling got every big laugh in the theater while I was watching Barbie. His comedic timing is next level, and what I think is particularly impressive about his performance is that, at least on paper, Ken is a pretty one-note character, but Ryan Gosling is so good in this role that he manages to elevate the material and make Ken feel like a whole, well-rounded, three-dimensional individual. He was phenomenal, and quite frankly, you should believe the buzz. His performance is worthy of an Oscar nomination. Margot Robbie, Ryan Gosling, and Kate McKinnon are the standouts because they understand what movie they're in. The physical comedy in this movie is hilarious, and I just enjoy every little bit of it. It's the small attention to details, like the way Barbie sits down with her legs sitting straight out, because of course dolls can't sit down in a proper sitting position. It's the fun little visual gags like that, and the very stiff way that Margot Robbie moves during her all is lost moment in the third act, when she fully succumbs to this existential crisis and she moves with this hyper-rigidity that you only see in a doll. This is the kind of stuff that makes Barbie fun and hilarious for all audiences. But now that I've said what I had to say, in particular what I had to say about Ken, maybe now this guy can explain his perspective and his deeper understanding of the film, because maybe once he finishes with his little think piece here, if you're not asleep by the end, you might realize that Ken is actually not a one-note character in terms of how he's written on the page. So, without further ado, I suppose I'll let this guy talk now. We're going back to the Mojo Dojo Casa House. That's right. Yeah. Despite being a very pro-feminist movie, Barbie is truly a profound exploration of the gender roles of both men and women, because Barbie Land essentially functions as a parody of the real world, in the sense that women are the ones in power. They control everything, they have all of the prestige, elite, upper echelon jobs, and the Kens are just set dressing. They're superfluous, just like Barbie said, and they're treated as nothing more than accessories. And the reason I think this is so interesting is because the minute Barbie and Ken go to the real world and they see that the very idea of Barbie, the girl boss, radical feminism did not actually solve anything. What ends up happening is Ken turns into one of these hyper-masculine red pillars, very much in the vein of Andrew Tate and his cult of clowns. And the reason I find this so fascinating is because Ken's character arc is he doesn't feel like he has a place in the world. He feels unmotivated. He feels like he has no purpose. He feels disenfranchised. And when he sees for the first time that it doesn't have to be that way, when he feels empowered, he goes back to take over Barbie Land and he turns it into a giant frat house. But the reason I think all of this is so much deeper than it actually is because all of the Barbies living in Barbie Land think that they have solved misogyny. They think they have dismantled the patriarchy. And the real world serves as a kind of reflection that that's not true. It didn't actually solve anything. In fact, all it did was create a subset of very problematic, hyper-masculine guys that feel the need to prove their worth in the most ridiculous ways possible. And that causes a lot of conflict among just the men. It causes a lot of conflict among men and women, among women and women. And that, to me, is where the movie really starts to do something profound, because I think this is probably the most interesting and brilliant exploration of both men and women in modern society. Because the ending of Barbie, surprise, surprise, is the Barbies and the Kens coming together and realizing that there is no way to make a complete ultra-feminism matriarchy work. And there is also no way to make a complete ultra-masculine patriarchy work. Instead, they decide to come together and find a solution 50-50, which I think is realistically where most people stand on this issue. I think that's the more human response. And when I think about Barbie in that context, that completely changes the movie for me. It alters the messaging, however clunky I found the execution to be at times. It sort of reframes the entire movie for me, and I really do think Barbie is probably one of the best movies of the year. So for that reason, it is obviously going to get a big recommendation from me, and I hope that if you do go watch Barbie, that you all enjoy it, because I do think there are so many lessons to be gleaned from this movie. Again, not just for women, but I do acknowledge that this movie is probably going to be more important to women. It's probably going to mean more to them. And I did watch this movie with my sister and my mom, because I did grow up with a little sister, and I grew up playing with her. I'm not going to sit here and lie to you. Yeah, I would play with Barbies. We would combine my superhero action figures and her Barbies and just make up stories. That's what we did. So I watched this movie with women. I'm taking their perspective into consideration. And if the Barbie movie can mean as much to any little girl out there as the Batman did to me last year, then that is exactly why this movie needed to be made. And for all the guys out there that are saying this movie is anti-men, I think you're kind of missing the point, because Barbie Land is serving as a reflection of how a lot of women feel in the real world. But there is so much more to chew on here with Barbie. As I said, I really do think there is more to this movie in terms of gender roles and how the radical feminism has led to this ridiculous alpha male red pill movement, and how these two things really feed off of each other in a vicious cycle. And while the Barbie movie may not solve these issues, I think it has done something very important, and that is start the discussion. And I hope that we can all do that respectfully and kindly. Those are my very complex thoughts on Barbie, and I'm sure everybody will receive them warmly. And until then, thank you for watching, guys. Peace, plants, namaste.